In the winter of 1942, the skies over Europe belonged to Germany. Every morning, long streams of American bombers rose slowly from English airfields, heavy with fuel, bombs, and hope. The men inside them believed they were part of something unstoppable, daylight precision bombing, a strategy meant to break Nazi industry and end the war faster. What they did not yet understand was how exposed they truly were. The B-17 Flying Fortress was powerful, but it was not invincible. And more importantly, it was alone. At first, the plan seemed sound. Bombers would fly in tight formations, overlapping fields of defensive gunfire, protecting each other. German fighters, it was believed, would be shredded before they could do serious damage. Reality was very different. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe pilots had adapted. They learned the blind spots. They attacked head-on where defensive fire was weakest and closing speeds were deadly. They came in waves, firing rockets and cannon shells designed to tear bombers apart in seconds. The bombers kept coming, and they kept falling. Mission after mission returned with gaps in formation. Some aircraft limped home damaged beyond repair. Others never came back at all. The numbers were horrifying. On some raids, loss rates reached 10%. At that pace, a bomber crew's chances of completing a full tour were almost non-existent. Air crew knew it. They joked about it, dark humor masking fear. The flak gets you if the fighters don't. The fighters get you if the flak doesn't. What terrified them most was not the bombing run. It was the long journey there and back. German fighters did not need to chase bombers all the way to England. They simply waited. As soon as American escort fighters turned back, low on fuel, the bombers were naked. And that moment came every time. Early escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Spitfire were brave, capable aircraft, but they lacked one critical thing: range. They could escort bombers part of the way, then they had to turn around. German pilots knew the exact point where American fighters peeled off. They even had a name for it: the fighter gap. Beyond it, the bombers were theirs. Entire Luftwaffe units were dedicated to this task, not to dogfighting escorts, but to hunting bombers. And the bombers paid the price. On October 14, 1943, a mission later known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force sent hundreds of bombers deep into Germany to strike Schweinfurt. They lost 60 aircraft in a single day. 600 men gone. The impact on morale was devastating. Commanders began to question whether daylight bombing could continue at all. Some argued the losses were unsustainable. Others insisted there was no alternative. The truth was simple. The bombers did not need better guns. They did not need tighter formations. They needed protection, all the way to the target and back. What they needed did not yet exist in the numbers required. But somewhere in the background, quietly, an aircraft was being refined that would change everything. It wasn't famous yet. It wasn't trusted yet. In fact, many pilots initially dismissed it. Its early versions had been underpowered. Its design looked fragile compared to heavier fighters. But once the right engine was installed, everything changed. That aircraft was the P-51 Mustang. And when it finally arrived in force, the war in the air would never be the same again. Because for the first time, the bombers would not fly alone. When the P-51 Mustang began appearing on American airfields in England in late 1943, it did not arrive with fanfare. There were no speeches, no declarations that the air war had been solved. Many pilots were skeptical. They had seen war-winning aircraft promised before. The Mustang looked sleek, almost delicate compared to the bulky P-47 Thunderbolt. Its wings were thinner, its fuselage narrower. To some bomber crews, it did not look like the kind of fighter that could survive over Germany. But what mattered was not how it looked. What mattered was how far it could go. Early escort fighters had forced the 8th Air Force into a deadly compromise: protect the bombers for part of the mission, then abandon them at the most dangerous point. The Mustang erased that compromise. With external drop tanks and its efficient design, the P-51 could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. No Allied fighter had ever done that. For the first time, German pilots could not simply wait for escorts to turn away. The fighter gap disappeared. The change was immediate and shocking. Luftwaffe pilots who had grown used to attacking unprotected bomber streams now found themselves intercepted far from home. The Mustangs did not hover close to the bombers like earlier escorts. They ranged ahead, hunted aggressively, and attacked German fighters before they could organize. This was a fundamental shift in doctrine. The Mustang pilots were not there just to defend. They were there to dominate the sky. German fighters scrambled, expecting the usual pattern: a brief escort, then open season on bombers. Instead, they were met by long-range American fighters already waiting at altitude, engines cool, pilots alert. Engagements began earlier, they lasted longer, and they ended badly for the Luftwaffe. The Mustang's performance made it deadly in multiple ways. It could climb high enough to intercept, dive fast enough to pursue, and turn well enough to fight on equal terms. But its greatest weapon was endurance. A Mustang pilot could stay with the bombers for hours. That meant pressure, constant pressure. German pilots no longer had the luxury of choosing when to attack. They were forced into combat repeatedly, often far from friendly airfields, burning fuel they could not easily replace. Losses began to mount. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, the veterans who had survived the early years of the war, were suddenly vulnerable, and when they were lost, there were fewer trained replacements to take their place. Bomber crews noticed the difference almost immediately. Where missions had once felt like long waits for inevitable attack, now there was movement in the sky, American fighters weaving above and around the formations, tracer fire arcing outward instead of inward. Pilots reported fewer coordinated attacks. Fighter groups that once formed up cleanly were being broken apart before they reached the bombers. The psychological effect was enormous. For the first time, bomber crews felt they were not being sacrificed, they were being protected. This did not mean missions were suddenly safe. Flak was still deadly, fighters still got through, bombers were still lost, but the balance had shifted. Loss rates began to drop, and, just as importantly, German confidence began to crack. Interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots revealed frustration and disbelief. They spoke of American fighters that never left, of escorts that seemed endless. Some units began avoiding combat altogether unless absolutely necessary. Others rushed attacks, making mistakes that proved fatal. The skies over Germany were no longer a hunting ground. They were contested, and the P-51 Mustang was at the center of that change. But this transformation came at a cost. Mustang pilots flew deep into enemy territory with little margin for error. If they were hit, bailout meant capture, or worse. Fuel revealed their position. Mechanical failure far from base could be fatal. They accepted the risk because they understood the mission. If the bombers survived, the war moved closer to its end. And as 1944 approached, the Mustang would be given an even more dangerous role, one that went far beyond escort. By early 1944, the P-51 Mustang was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become a weapon designed to break the German Air Force itself. The change was deliberate. American commanders had reached a hard conclusion. As long as the Luftwaffe existed in strength, bomber losses would continue. Defensive escort alone was not enough. So, the rules changed. Mustang pilots were given new orders. Do not stay close. Do not wait to be attacked. Go after them. The P-51s began flying ahead of bomber formations, sweeping German airspace before the bombers even arrived. They attacked airfields, intercepted fighters during climb, and chased damaged aircraft back toward their bases. This was relentless pressure. For the Luftwaffe, the air war became exhausting. Pilots scrambled only to be intercepted before forming up. Fuel was wasted. Aircraft were lost on takeoff and landing. Veteran pilots were forced into repeated combat with little time to recover. German training could not keep up. Where once Luftwaffe pilots trained for hundreds of hours, new pilots in 1944 were receiving only a fraction of that time. They were sent into combat unprepared, facing experienced Mustang pilots who had already flown multiple missions over enemy territory. The results were predictable and devastating. Bomber crews felt the difference. The sky ahead of them was often already alive with combat, but fewer German fighters made it through. Attacks that did occur were less coordinated, less aggressive, sometimes desperate. Radio chatter reflected the change. German calls became frantic. American pilots spoke of opponents who broke off quickly or fled after brief engagements. This was not cowardice, it was survival. The Mustang's range allowed it to stay and fight until the Luftwaffe had nothing left to give. Perhaps the most important effect was invisible. The Luftwaffe lost initiative. Every sortie became reactive. Every mission was a response to American movement. German fighters were no longer shaping the battle. They were being drawn into it on unfavorable terms. Airfields once considered safe were no longer so. Mustangs attacked parked aircraft, fuel dumps, and maintenance areas. Even damaged fighters returning from combat were hunted down, denied the chance to land and repair. By spring 1944, German losses were accelerating faster than replacements could be produced. Aircraft numbers might have looked sufficient on paper, but experienced pilots were gone, and without pilots, aircraft were useless. This collapse in air power had consequences far beyond the bomber streams. German ground forces were now exposed. Railways, bridges, and troop movements were attacked from the air with growing impunity. Supplies moved only at night, and even then, not safely. The P-51 was not alone in this effort, but it was essential. Its ability to stay, to pursue, and to return made sustained pressure possible. For bomber crews, this meant something remarkable. Survival indicated not luck, but strategy. Losses continued, but missions that once guaranteed heavy casualties now often returned with most aircraft intact. The psychological shift was profound. Crews who once counted missions until death now counted missions until rotation home. That change alone saved thousands of lives. But the greatest test was still coming, because in June 1944, the war would demand absolute air superiority, and the Mustang would be asked to prove that the Luftwaffe was not just weakened, but broken. In Part 4, the P-51 faces its defining moment, D-Day, and the final collapse of German air resistance. By June 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its decisive moment. Everything depended on air superiority. The Allied invasion of Western Europe, D-Day, could not succeed unless the skies were controlled completely. Troop landings, supply ships, airborne drops, and armored breakthroughs all required one thing above all else: the enemy must not be allowed into the air. This was where the P-51 Mustang proved its ultimate value. In the weeks leading up to June 6th, Mustang pilots flew relentlessly. They escorted bombers deep into Germany by day, then returned to attack rail yards, airfields, bridges, and fuel depots. The goal was simple: leave the Luftwaffe unable to respond. By the time Allied forces crossed the English Channel, German fighter opposition was almost absent. On D-Day itself, more than 11,000 Allied aircraft filled the sky. German fighters appeared only in small numbers, isolated, disorganized, and quickly driven away. This was not because Germany lacked aircraft, it was because it lacked pilots, fuel, coordination, and freedom of movement. The P-51 Mustang had helped destroy all four. Mustangs patrolled the beaches, strafed armored columns, and intercepted any aircraft attempting to reach the invasion area. They flew so low that pilots could see individual vehicles and troops on the ground. For Allied soldiers landing on the beaches, the absence of German aircraft was shocking. Veterans later said they expected air attacks that never came. That silence in the sky saved tens of thousands of lives. After D-Day, the Luftwaffe never recovered. What remained was forced into defensive reactions. Training collapsed, fuel shortages worsened, new aircraft sat unused because there were no experienced pilots left to fly them. Meanwhile, Mustang pilots gained confidence bordering on certainty. They knew they could go anywhere, and they did. They escorted bombers to Berlin. They hunted fighters over their own airfields. They destroyed transport routes that kept German armies supplied. The P-51's role evolved again, not just escort, but air dominance. Bomber losses dropped dramatically compared to 1943. Factories once unreachable were destroyed. Germany's ability to wage modern war began to fail at the system level. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper. Desperate measures followed. Jet fighters rushed into service, inexperienced teenagers thrown into cockpits, last-minute defenses that arrived too late. The air war was already decided. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine, German resistance from the air was negligible. The bomber offensive continued almost unchallenged until the end of the war. Looking back, historians are clear on one fact. Strategic bombing did not become truly effective until the Mustang arrived. The bomber alone was vulnerable. The escort alone was insufficient. Together, they were unstoppable. The P-51 Mustang did not win the war by itself, but it solved a problem that had nearly broken the daylight bombing campaign. It gave bombers reach, it gave crews survival, it gave commanders confidence, and it gave the Allies what they needed most: time and control of the sky. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Mustang had become more than an aircraft. It was proof that technology, range, and strategy, when combined correctly, could change the course of history. The mighty 8th Air Force did not survive by chance. It survived because the P-51 Mustang made survival possible.